Good morning and welcome to the fourth webinar in our Access for All guest speaker webinar series as we get closer to expanding CalFresh eligibility to SSI recipients starting on June 1st. My name is Brian Kaiser and I'm the Chief of the CalFresh and Nutrition Programs Bureau here at the California Department of Social Services, as well as your host for today's webinar. This program expansion marks a historic moment for California and will significantly increase the number of Californians eligible for CalFresh food assistance. As we prepare for this change, this is a great opportunity to spend some time thinking about how we can truly make CalFresh food benefits accessible to all and develop a better understanding of what it means to serve a diversity of clients. The intent of this webinar series is to provide a platform for a range of guest speakers to address the topic of making CalFresh accessible to all. Today's webinar presentation is about serving people in multiple languages and welcoming immigrants. Through this webinar, we hope that you learn something new or gain a new perspective or a new way of thinking about how you can most effectively do your work each day. We then hope that you incorporate these lessons learned into your practice as we race toward the June 1, 2019 implementation. We are joined today by Lena Moran from Just Communities, the Central Coast office. First, though, let's go over some webinar logistics and give everyone a quick refresher on the policy change that brought us together for this webinar series. Today's webinar will be in listen-only mode, which means you can hear us either through your telephone or through your computer, but note that all lines will be muted during this presentation. We're happy to be offering live closed captioning for people with hearing challenges by clicking on the link shown on your screen in the chat window, and we will also upload a closed caption version of this webinar and all of the others in the series to our webpage at cdss.ca.gov/CalFreshSSI. This brings me to the next logistical detail. How do you ask questions? You can ask questions by using the question pane feature on the right side of your screen. For today's presentation, we won't be answering questions live, but please submit any questions you have at any time during the presentation, and we will be collecting those and providing responses back to all recipients after the webinar. Responses will also be posted to our website along with any materials and a recording of today's presentation. Next slide. Next, I'd like to do a quick reminder for the last webinar in our Access for All guest speaker series. Serving diverse communities and advancing racial equity is this afternoon at 1 p.m. If you haven't done so already, you can register for this on our website. And if you missed any of the previous webinars in the series or want to download copies of the materials, please visit our website shown on screen at cdss.ca.gov/info-resources/CalFreshSSI/training. Next slide. Before I turn it over to Lena, let's provide everyone with a quick review of the upcoming policy change that will expand CalFresh eligibility to SSI recipients. California's cash-out policy started in 1974 when the federal government began the combined federal and state SSI-SSP program. At the time, states were allowed to increase the SSP portion of the grant instead of administering what was then known as the food stamp program. California opted for this cash-out policy, as it's known, and increased the monthly SSP grant by $10. Back then, this change made sense, as that amount was roughly equivalent to the average food benefit in 1974, and it was an efficient way to provide food benefits to the eligible population. Under the cash-out policy, SSI recipients have been ineligible for CalFresh food benefits because, in theory, they were already receiving the value of CalFresh benefits within their SSP grant. The challenge, of course, is that over time, the value of CalFresh benefits has increased with the rate of inflation, while the SSI cash-in amount has remained flat at $10 since 1974 and has lost relative value. This means that many SSI recipients who are living on a very limited budget, which is intended to cover all basic needs, are likely to have unmet food needs and are unable to apply for CalFresh food assistance. Last summer, Assembly Bill 1811 passed as part of the state budget, which ended the policy known as cash-out and put the wheels in motion to allow people in California who are receiving SSI or SSP to apply for CalFresh food benefits on or after June 1st, 2019. It's important to remember that there will be no change to the combined SSI-SSP benefit as a result of this policy change. This simply provides an opportunity for affected households to increase their total budget with monthly food assistance. Next slide. With that, I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker for today. Lena Moran, who is the Program Manager with Just Communities Central Coast Office. Welcome and thank you for sharing with us today, Lena. I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody, and greetings from Oxnard, California. Thank you so much for having me here today. Next slide. Just before we start, I'd like to give you a little bit of an overview of our organization, the work that we do, and why we are here today. Just Communities is a nonprofit organization. We are based in Santa Barbara and Santa Maria, but serve the Central Coast and the state. Really, we have a vision for creating an equitable and inclusive Central Coast where everybody is connected, respected, and valued. And through our work, really trying to make sure that the Central Coast is a place of opportunity and not of limitation. And when you think about language, it often creates limitations for people who are either learning English or non-English proficient or monolingual in any other language but English. And so we really want to develop leaders like yourselves to be able to connect people across differences of language, of ethnicity, of race, of immigration experience. Next slide. And so the work that I do with the Language Justice Initiative really focuses on two populations. One is training and supporting folks that are bilingual and provide the interpretation or translation service. But also we want to provide training for folks working with interpreters who might be monolingual themselves or bilingual but not capable of performing the interpretation service, because a successful multilingual space really depends on everybody. And so we'll be talking about some of those guidelines today. Next slide. A little bit about myself. I am the program manager at Just Communities for the Language Justice Initiative. I've been an interpreter and a translator as well since I was about 8 years old, and some of that work has included social services in work that I've done with the community and work that I've done with school districts, with nonprofits, with government agencies, and I'm also a language access consultant. So on top of the interpretation and translation training, I also provide guidelines and helping organizations, school districts, et cetera, create their language access guidelines. So we'll be talking about how to incorporate that as well. Next slide. So the objectives for today, as you can see, we're going to talk about language access and really understand why it's a critical part of effectively serving and working with multilingual communities. Also to leave you with some best practices for some multilingual outreach and engagement, meetings and events where you might be encouraging folks or signing up folks for CalFresh, and really looking at best practices for working with immigrant populations. Next slide. So as we talk about language access, Just Communities really brings in a language justice lens to this work. Because in order to do the work, we have to have this commitment to make sure that all voices are welcome and respected and valued, not just the voices that we hear, that we speak, or the languages that we're comfortable in, but really all of our clients. And so in order to do that, we have to have a process in place that allows people to participate in the language that they feel comfortable using, again, not the one that we're comfortable with or the one that we know. And so in order to do this, we have to put tools in place. And once we have tools such as interpretation or translation, then we're able to effectively serve people across many, many differences. So we don't have to be bilingual or multilingual ourselves or be able to do interpretation or translation if we're able to have these tools in place. And so, of course, in our state where many languages are present, this is going to be an essential component of cultural proficiency. And again, we really want to make sure that everybody's voices are truly heard and included. This is a change that CalFresh is creating. And so we want to make sure that any services or feedback along the way is heard and is heard by all the voices that want to participate. Next slide. And so why? Right? The question is, why not just English? Why not just have people be served in English or answer in English? And so again, at Just Communities, we really believe that there's intersectionality. Language doesn't just exist on its own. We're really looking at how it intersects with different things like racism or ableism or nativism. And so a lot of the work that we do is advocating for rights of people to have their languages recognized and respected for them to be, again, able to participate fully 100%, regardless of the language that they use. And through the work, we're then able to connect people, give them access to service, provide the information that they're going to need. And by doing so, we're creating multilingual spaces, right, where no one language dominates the other, but really everybody feels comfortable engaging and participating and receiving information as well. Next slide. So as we're waiting for the next slide, the next one you'll see is a quote by Nelson Mandela, which talks about language justice and why we do the work that we do, and why it's important that you all receive some training in language access and language justice. Next slide, please. So Nelson Mandela tells us, if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. And so when you think about the work that you're doing, you're experts at what you're doing. You are experts at making sure that people are receiving the services, that they're signing up, that all of their forms are in place, that all the requirements are there. But if we give people the information only in English, we really run the risk that not everybody will understand 100% what it is that we need from them and what it is that they need to understand in order to receive the service. However, if we speak to people in their language, then they can really internalize the information and be able to talk about it. Perhaps spread the word to their friends or family, really talk about the benefits of the services that they're receiving. And so we want to keep this in mind as we're working through language justice is really tied in with language access. And we want to make sure that we're not just giving people information and then leaving it to them to figure out, did they understand it or not, or maybe finding a family member or a neighbor or somebody to interpret it for them, perhaps incorrectly. Rather, we want to make sure that we're giving accurate information from the start. Next slide. So again, let's talk about why. Why not just English? Because we do hear that a lot in the work. But when you look at this particular chart, it's showing us the comparison of folks speaking English by nativity and by duration in California. So a native-born speaker, which you see on the left side of your screen, can attain almost 100% fluency, right, of speaking well. And again, that depends on education, location, etc. But it's a pretty good sense of fluency. Somebody that's born, for example, there are many, many countries that are raising bilingual individuals as a requirement in school, and so they can attain a pretty high level of proficiency. And I'm sorry, I'm seeing that it's cut out at the bottom, but where it says less than 10 to 30 plus, that should say the duration that an immigrant is in the United States. So to look at how many years somebody has to be in the country in order to attain some level of proficiency, you're looking at 30 plus years, right? That's what you're seeing on your right-hand side there. And that doesn't take into consideration where they might attain the language. Perhaps it's at work, perhaps it's, in a community setting. It doesn't really speak to an educational type of language. So many of the products or the services that we're offering sometimes are in a very high register that's not as easy for folks to understand. So we're going to talk about how to make sure that we're speaking a language per se that is more accessible. But keeping this in mind, we will always have the need for language access. When you look at this chart, what happens with migration is usually the generation that comes to the United States won't attain the language. And that's where you're looking at the progression of having to be in the country for more than 30 years to achieve proficiency. Typically, it's the second or third generations that will acquire the English language, sometimes as a primary language. And so we will always have a need, right? As long as migration patterns continue to occur, we will always have a need for interpretation, translation, for language access in services. Next slide. And so through the work that Just Communities has done throughout the Central Coast, throughout the state, we've heard from clients in various settings, in particular to social services, they don't necessarily feel welcome coming to an office because they don't speak English. And they're not 100% confident that somebody will be there that can greet them, that can help them. They might also not attend community events or meetings. So for example, if you were having a community meeting or a tabling event about how people could sign up for CalFresh, they might not attend again because they don't speak English, and so there's a very low level of comfort around being there, around making sure that they can receive information. Because they don't speak English or English well, they might not be sure where to ask for help or where to get accurate information. And so that might deter them from seeking out the services that you're providing. But sometimes folks have used an interpreter, maybe not necessarily a professional interpreter, perhaps just a bilingual person acting in that capacity, but they don't always feel comfortable that what they're saying is being transmitted or what the service provider is saying is being transmitted. And we've heard that discomfort from clients, that sometimes bilingual folks who are acting in the capacity, because they don't have the training, they will either summarize or they will shorten the message or change it a little bit, maybe because they don't know how to negotiate the language. And we'll be talking about that as well. But it is important to understand that families experience anxiety, mental and emotional and physical trauma. And so even in language, there's some sensitivity that we need to have to understand that providing the service is our goal, but there's many components around it to make sure that we're successful. Next slide. So we also have, on the other side, we work with interpreters or bilingual folks who are acting in this capacity. And what we're hearing from them is that perhaps, when an intake is over, the client will approach them after and say, can you just tell me everything that happened in there because I did not understand anything. And this particular person who's in the interpreter position isn't always somebody that's knowledgeable. Perhaps they're just a bilingual employee, a front office employee that was called in to do the work. And again, you are all going to be the experts of this. You hold the information, you know how to sign people up, what information you need to give them, the accurate information. And so we want to make sure that clients feel comfortable asking you questions in the session or during an information session and not having to ask a third party after who might not be able to give them this information. Sometimes as well, the staff themselves or the service providers will ask the interpreter to make sure that the client understands everything and to explain or answer their questions. And we're going to talk a little bit about what it is that an interpreter actually does versus what we think they do. And in this situation, again, remembering that you are the experts, you know this process, you know what clients need, you know what you need from them, and wanting to make sure, again, that we use the interpreter in the right capacity. Sometimes interpreters don't get breaks, right? We'll go from meeting to meeting or intake to intake, and I've heard interpreters who worked up to 4 long meetings in a row, which could be an hour each or 2 hours each without a break. And we want to make sure that the interpreters that we're using are capable of doing the work, that they're providing accurate information. So we'll talk about how to make sure that we're setting up these spaces so that they're not just convenient for us as service providers, but also for the team that we're working with. You do have a lot of forms that are already translated, but we have heard that service providers sometimes will ask our interpreters to sight translate documents. Sight translation means that the interpreter is reading the document in one language, English perhaps, and then interpreting it out loud into the language that they need, the target language. And that's not an easy task, right? It's not an easy task. And I ask you to think about, how does it feel to just read out loud? That's not very comfortable for all of us to read a document out loud. And so now think about having to transpose it in your head into a different language and making sure that it's accurate. And so this can provide a challenge because you want to provide the most accurate information and you want to receive accurate information as well. We want to make sure that we're setting up our bilingual folks in this capacity to succeed and not to fail. And finally, there is, for those of you who might be monolingual, you definitely can work with an interpreter, right? Not everybody has to be bilingual or multilingual, but we have heard case managers or service providers who have asked interpreters to just run the session. This one, for example, was in Spanish. And they said to the interpreter, you can practically do my job. You do it all the time. You are in here in these meetings all the time. Why don't you just run the meeting yourself? And this can get very dangerous in terms of compliance, in terms of issues. So we want to make sure that, again, it's a service provider that can do their job. You can do it in the language that you feel comfortable in, and then working with an interpreter to make sure that your client is also understanding. So who are the clients that we will be working with? Next slide. It's important when we're working with immigrant populations, number one, to make sure we ask them what language they prefer to use, right? Versus assuming the language or assuming that we know what their level of comfort is. And so it's a very easy question to ask, what language would you like to receive the service in? And you'll have a variety of answers. There are some folks who, for example, my expertise is with Spanish and English interpretation. And in the population that I work with, we have some Spanish speakers who are very hesitant to work with an interpreter because there's a lot of mistrust. They want to make sure that they understand and that they get all the information. And they don't necessarily trust that this third party will give them that information. So sometimes they choose to just kind of battle through and see what they can pick up. But if we ask, what language would you like to hear this information in? That creates a sense of comfort for your client, because now you're asking them versus telling them or assuming, oh, do you speak English? Or, oh, do you speak Spanish? Or do you speak, etc. So with that in mind, developing and using intake forms and other documents in a variety of languages is very important. Keeping in mind that not everybody is auditory. And so even if they're choosing to let you run that session in English, at least there's something that they can read and visually have as a reference. If you're using interpretation and translation, it's another wonderful tool to have. So they could be looking at an intake form, for instance, or the requirements in a language that they understand and feel comfortable with. Because again, we want to make your job easy. We don't want to have people come back, various times with incorrect documents. So if we get this right from the start, hopefully you'll be successful and with that client and have all of their requirements ready. We also want to have access to trained and qualified interpreters. These can be bilingual employees, and we'll talk about how to make sure that you're using appropriate tools to do that. We really want to stay away from using minors or other family members. And that has been a practice that I've seen for a very long time. It certainly was my experience when I was growing up, about 8 years old, right, when I finally learned the English language enough to master it and be able to go from one language to the other. That's really when I started helping my neighborhood, and they would take me to different places to require services, whether it was medical or social services. And I was the one who was asking the questions, where do you live and what's your income? And I didn't always know the language. As an 8-year-old, I didn't really understand why they were asking what I thought were pretty intrusive questions. And at that time, there were even vocabulary that I didn't know. And so we really want to stay away from having minors interpret. Sometimes the information that they might learn is too much, or things that youth should not have. And so we also want to stay away from having other family members interpret. There are confidentiality issues, impartiality issues as well, which we'll talk about. And so again, when working with immigrant populations, we really want to avoid using jargon or high-level vocabulary that might be difficult even for our interpreters to understand, the folks that are providing this service for us. And that can get tricky because, as I said, you are all experts at what you're doing. You kind of live in this world. You're very comfortable with this vocabulary. But it's important to understand that the person that's coming in to work with you, this might be their first exposure to the kind of language that you're using. So staying away from things like acronyms, or making sure that if you say the acronym that you're able to, spell it out. And again, that'll help your interpreter as well, so that if you say whatever acronym you say, they're not just going to interpret the same letters and leave your client in the dark. Very important when working with immigrants, and I'm hoping that your Serving Diverse Communities and Advancing Racial Equity webinar will also cover this in detail. We really want to avoid making generalizations or stereotypes based on ethnicity or gender. This is something where you do have to check your bias a little bit as you're walking in. And rather than coming in with stereotypes or assuming that we know because maybe we're also from that culture, that deters the client from really making sure that they tell you their experience. And not all immigrant experiences are the same, right? We don't want to kind of romanticize this immigrant experience of a hard struggle or somebody that had it really easy, because we want to make sure that every person that comes in can tell you whatever it is that they need to tell you in their own language without us assuming that we know, which will bring us to the last point here. And it's really about asking culturally sensitive questions rather than making assumptions. In interpretation, we want to make sure that we're not relying on the interpreter and saying, hey, can you please ask the client, but rather making sure that you are asking the questions. If there's something that the interpreter says to you that you don't understand from the client, then make sure you refer back to the client and ask a little bit more. And that is more than okay, to reach out to the client and say, I'm not really familiar with this. Can you tell me a little bit more? Especially if they tell you anything that's, culturally relevant to them and maybe not necessarily to you. Next slide. So you've heard interpretation and translation throughout this presentation, and for the sake of some common language, these are very essential tools when we're talking about working in multilingual spaces, though they're not the only ones. But for some common language, interpretation refers to auditory or visual. So anytime that you have an interpreter, you'll hear the client speak and then the interpreter repeats it and then you speak. That's interpretation, and also sign language. Those are forms of interpretation. When we're talking about translation, now we're talking about transferring messages in a written language. So that's very important because those seem to be used interchangeably a lot. And although they function very similarly, it takes a very different type of skill set to be an interpreter and to be a translator. And so let's talk about, so what is the role of these folks? Next slide. And I think this picture illustrates the difference, the definition of what an interpreter is very, very accurately. When you're working with an interpreter, this person will, again, orally or visually, if they're using sign language, relay a message between two or more people who don't share a common language. The key part of this is that they're doing it without adding, deleting, or changing the message. So if you're working with a trained and qualified interpreter, whatever it is that you say to the client, that is what the client will be receiving in their language. And likewise, their response or their question will be coming to you accurately. Next slide. And so here's a question to ponder, because oftentimes interpretation has been done very unofficially. It's been done perhaps by our bilingual staff. Any of you out there that are multilingual most likely have done this at some point in your life, again, either in an official setting or not, and really thinking, what about summarizing or paraphrasing, right? Why not just do that? Why do we have to say the whole message? And when we think about paraphrasing is saying the same thing in a different way, right? And summarizing is just kind of giving key points. But anytime we do this, we're putting it through our own filter. And in that sense, we might not be giving the client or you, the service provider, all the information that you actually need. So we want to really stay away from summarizing, because whatever I think the key points are might not be the key points that the client needs, right? Or if I paraphrase the way that a client said something because I don't really understand, or maybe they kind of rambled on and I just wanted to give you the gist. But it's really important that we're giving the full message. So let's talk about when working with interpreters, why is it important that we hire somebody or we train somebody to be qualified? Next slide. So working with interpreters requires very, very specific skills. So this is a little tricky for those of you out there who are bilingual or multilingual and have used or have been used or worked as interpreters at some point, again, either officially or not. It's very important that interpreters have advanced proficiency in all of the languages that they're using. The reason that we don't just use anybody that's bilingual is because not everybody has that high level of proficiency. Perhaps, and I know from experience that many of us here in California, at least who speak Spanish, are known as heritage speakers, which means we really learn the language at home, perhaps, but never necessarily learn to read it or an academic language. And we might be able to speak it in conversation, but we might not necessarily know all of the jargon and all of the terms that are more academic. And so, again, when working with interpreters, we really want to make sure that we're speaking proficiently and able to transfer messages proficiently, because interpreters do process things very, very quickly. They're listening to messages. They're essentially stripping it down to the codes and making sure they understand every word and every nuance, and then kind of reconstructing it in the other language in order to be able to produce it. There's also strong memory retention. Sometimes when we're working with service providers or with clients, they will go on for a very, very long time, right? And they won't really pay attention to the interpreter. And a lot of this is because many of us are not used to working with interpreters. So interpreters have to have very, very strong memory retention and concentration as well. As you know, when you're doing the work, there's always a million things going on, whether it's papers that are shuffling or somebody asking a question or a side conversation or the phone ringing. And interpreters have to work through this because they have to be very, very careful and pay high attention to detail. Every little thing matters. We want to make sure that all the information that you're capturing is accurate. If you're ever at a point where you're doing presentations to the community and perhaps using what we call simultaneous interpretation, which is when the speaker is talking and the interpreter is repeating the message at the same time, that's a whole different set of skills where you're listening and talking at the same time. Next slide. Interpreters also need to have very specific knowledge, right? Again, with all the proficiency, including different dialects, right? I'm so sorry, it looks like this is a double, but we have to, when working with interpreters, really, really understanding that they don't necessarily understand or know all the ins and outs of your profession or of your work, but rather they're just there to transfer your message. You are the expert, and the client is the expert on their life and on their needs. And the interpreter is really there just to transmit that message back and forth and make sure that it looks like a monolingual space, except you're working with an interpreter. And if we are successful, then we are able to have a conversation even though we don't share the same language. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about interpretation is a profession. It definitely has its own set of ethics and standards, so rules that interpreters must follow. And these are key to know if you perhaps are monolingual and you're going to be working with immigrant populations or multilingual populations, understanding that interpreters aim to be accurate. So their goal is to transmit every message as accurately as possible, also to maintain confidentiality so that they won't be sharing any details. And this is particularly important to your clients because they want to make sure that when they're coming in, they're trusting you with their information. Any information that they're giving you, again, must be maintained confidential, and your interpreter should be able to speak to that at the beginning of a session. Interpreters are also impartial. In a sense, we are like machines. We really a much better in live version than Google Translate. But as interpreters, we don't have a stake in either side. So a really good interpreter will be able to just, as we say, stay in their lane and make sure that they're just transmitting messages, not adding here or asking questions of another party, because as the next point shows us, it's really about respect for all parties, making sure that we're transmitting the message whether we like it or not, whether we agree with what the speakers are saying or not. Also goes for, let's say that as a service provider, you accidentally forget to mention something, and your interpreter knows this because they've been working with you for a while. They would not be able to chime in and add and say, hey, by the way, you forgot about this form, or you forgot to tell them this, because ultimately they're just repeating your message. There's a lot of cultural awareness as well, but it's also important to remember that interpreters are not cultural experts. They're not cultural anthropologists. And again, going back to when we talked about working with immigrant populations, they also cannot make assumptions or pretend to know about a particular group of people, regardless. For example, I'm originally from Mexico City, but I can't tell you that I know how the culture of Mexico City is or how everybody who's from Mexico does this or thinks, because we want to avoid creating stereotypes. And again, your interpreter is not there as a participant in the intake or in the meeting. They're there to help you do your job in a different language. And so along with that, we want to make sure that our interpreters maintain role boundaries, that we are only using them in that capacity and not also as a service worker or as a liaison or as an advocate or anything else. Because they have to maintain this sense of professionalism as they're working. Next slide. So we want to make sure when we're talking about accessible language and communication, once again, a lot of the material that you might use perhaps might be a very academic English or very formal English, and making sure that when you're speaking, it's not at a high level, very jargon level, because you want to make sure that you're going to be able to communicate directly. Keep in mind that not all things translate into different languages. Mental health, for example, is a particular term. I can tell you again from experience to English and Spanish, there's a translation and you can say salud mental, but we also work with indigenous speakers in Ventura County and northern Santa Barbara County, for instance, who speak Mixteco, and there is no translation for mental health. So now we're talking about a term that does not necessarily exist that our interpreters would then have to expand on. And so making sure that from the beginning, we are speaking in a way that will be understood. For those of you who are multilingual or bilingual, making sure to stay away from code switching, which basically is just going from language to language. If you are, finishing a whole sentence in one language is much more preferred than dropping in words here and there. It makes it very, very hard for interpreters. And I'll give you an example. For those of you who are bilingual, you'll be able to understand this because that is code switching. And for those of you who are not, I'm sorry, but you'll see how hard it is to keep up. But it's better to complete una oración completamente en un language instead of en two, porque es muy confusing, right? So also, just keeping in mind communication styles, right? Personal and cultural. If you've ever done any work around like low context cultures versus high context cultures, that's very important to keep in mind. There's some cultures that communicate very, very directly, right, to the point. There's other cultures that like to expand, that like to talk to you. Even though you're asking one thing, they will tell you 500 others. But even then, that's a style of communication that we need to respect. And that's something that your interpreter will interpret completely. And so we want to make sure we're not asking our interpreter like, hey, can you just give me the gist or just give me the key points? Because then we're really negating the fact that this person has opened up and really shared everything. And keep an eye out for body language as well, because that's important. Sometimes, right, our actions speak louder than words. And just ask you to think about the clients that you've worked with and see if there are any other aspects of acceptable language or communication, or even thinking about yourself and the way that you present yourself. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about you and your role as a service provider when working with multilingual communities. Number one, keep in mind if you're working with an interpreter, speak in short phrases. So a few sentences so that your interpreter can then repeat those accurately. This is very interesting and something that you'll have to work on if you haven't necessarily worked with an interpreter before. And so this will require a lot of self-reflection on your part, but really understanding that we have to avoid things like idioms or slang, right, or jargon that's super professional. And that can get very tricky because, again, not everything translates directly. And I'll give you an example. For example, if we were talking about somebody and they walked in through the door, the idiom in English is speak of the devil. But the same idiom in the Spanish language is hablando del rey de Roma, which translates to speaking of the king of Rome. And so you can see how they have, it's a similar meaning, but very different way of explaining that. And so for an interpreter who might not know the idiom, maybe they translate it directly, and that might not make sense to you or to your client. Also slang. Slang, of course, doesn't always necessarily translate. Sometimes it's because it's very cultural, right, or very relevant. Again, define any terms or acronyms that your clients or interpreters might not be familiar with. Keep in mind that, again, you are the expert. You know the ins and outs of the work that you're doing. Doesn't necessarily mean that your client will know everything that you're talking about. So not making assumptions that they do know or not know from the start, just making sure that you define anything that you talk about. When you are working with an interpreter and you have a client in front of you, make sure that you're speaking in first person. So speak directly to the client as opposed to saying, hey, can you ask her if she filled out this form? Can you ask him if he brought his ID? There's very few exceptions to that, but unless you are working with somebody that's intoxicated or a patient that, or a client that is perhaps like schizophrenic or who wouldn't understand why you have two people speaking, but that rarely occurs. So you want to make sure that you're talking to the client directly. Make sure you're looking at them. So address the client. Don't look at the interpreter. If they are trained and qualified, they should not be looking at you either, right? They should be maybe taking notes. So it's very important then that you're monitoring the interpreter and client interaction. If you say something, your interpreter should repeat it, but you shouldn't be observing a conversation happening between the interpreter and the client. And if you do, that's why you're monitoring and checking in as to why. Because remember, it's not a relationship between them. Really, the relationship is between you and the client. You're the service provider. So again, make sure if you're looking at your client, and this is very common, a lot of times we'll kind of see like blank stares or somebody that's just kind of nodding at everything. It's up to you to ask them, did you understand that? Can I make anything clear? Any questions that you might have? Please don't hesitate to ask me, because we want to make sure, again, that they're understanding and that they're not going to run out at the end of the session and ask your interpreter what just happened. Also, make sure to be present at all times during your intakes or meetings. So if you have to step out of the room for some reason, let's say you forgot a form or you need to go take a phone call, your interpreter needs to leave with you. What happens is if you leave the room, that is a great opportunity for your client to then look over at the interpreter and say, I did not understand what just happened. Please explain it to me, versus asking you. So try to be present at all times. If for some reason you do need to leave, just make sure your interpreter goes with you. And then finally, it's really important that you also debrief with your interpreter, with your team, because we want to make sure that you're checking in with them. So ask them, right? Did I use any slang? Did I use any terms that you didn't understand? Was I speaking too fast, or was I speaking too much? And they'll be able to tell you. So let's talk about what the interpreter's role is now. Next slide. And so for the interpreter, once again, their sole job is to interpret accurately and completely. Not what they want to interpret, not what they think they should interpret, but everything. Also, to maintain confidentiality, which is, again, why we stay away from dual roles. So you don't necessarily want to have the person in the front office also be the interpreter, or the family member that came with them, or the neighbor that came with them. But keep in mind, a lot of people might bring somebody with them just because that has been the experience. Because language access isn't always at the top of an organization's list. They don't always provide the service or have somebody capable of providing the service. And so for folks in the community, many people have just gotten used to bringing somebody. But interpreters are also not to give cues. They're not to interject with their own opinion. And they shouldn't be answering any questions or offering clarification. They should basically adhere to your instruction. And again, like we said, for you to debrief with them, they should be debriefing with you as well. And finally, they do a lot of assessment on vocabulary and comprehension. How did they carry out this task, right? Because interpretation should be seamless. It should feel like you're having a conversation as though you were speaking the same language, except yes, there's a little bit of a pause. Next slide. So in the last few minutes, we're going to talk about, so how do we plan to have this cross-language engagement? And rather than thinking like, well, did we bring an interpreter or did we translate something? Really think about, are you treating all your clients equitably? Next slide. So in order to create these spaces, yes, you have to have effective planning, which is part of doing this webinar and training. Then you have to have skilled interpreters as well, and there's training for them if you'd like as well. And then we have to make sure that everybody in the space is informed. Yourself, facilitators, participants, front office staff, service providers, everybody should be on the same page in order to make sure that we are providing this service. Next slide. So making sure, one, to schedule interpreters. If you know that you're going to have intakes that require them, will it be consecutive or simultaneous? What's the level of expertise of the person that you're having do this work? Trying to schedule at least 2 weeks in advance. That can get very tricky, so do your best. That is a best practice, and it'll just depend on your agency and the way that you schedule. Avoiding dual roles as well. So again, making sure that your interpreter is only there in that capacity and not also having to fulfill other roles. And any type of material you could provide interpreters to prepare is wonderful. You can maintain confidentiality, so you don't have to give any personal information, any names of clients coming in, but really anything that you're going to be presenting, whether it's a PowerPoint or a handout. Remember, sometimes they're going to have to read that document and produce it in a different language. And be mindful of the time. If it's going to be more than 1 hour, you're going to need at least 2 interpreters. And the reason for that is at 20 minutes or so, interpreters get tired. And so when fatigue sets in, accuracy drops. And we want to make sure that interpreters are always 100% on point so that they're giving you the most accurate information. Next slide. So looking at written materials, we want to make sure that they are equivalent in content and quality to the original English. And this is an example from schools. I do a lot of work with school districts, but for those of you out there who can read English and Spanish, this is quite the tragedy here. So we want to make sure to avoid things like Google Translate, that all of our documents are translated accurately. And I remember, for example, when I was growing up, every Thursday they would send home a beautiful, 4-page document at school, and then you would turn it around and there was only a half a paragraph in Spanish that kind of summarized. Or a lot of the time what I see are very, very poor translations, and that might be because people are using Google Translate or because they're using somebody that's not proficient in all languages. So let me give you an example of a poor translation. So next slide, please. Now, granted, I feel very successful when I walk out of the coffee line, but this is incorrect, right? The translation should say salida por aquí, right? Exit here, or exit only. And we want to avoid this. So it's very important when you're looking at translations to make sure that the language is accurate, all the grammar is accurate. For example, next slide, when we're looking at English and Spanish, be careful, right? You're talking about a father or you're talking about a potato. And so those are things that we might not be aware of if we're not proficient in the language. So anything that gets translated, just making sure that there's a second or third pair of eyes that can skim through and make sure that everything is accurate. I've seen a lot of translations in various spaces where they will forget, for example, the tilde on top of the N to make the ñ. And so I've seen a lot of things that say año when they really mean year, año. And año in Spanish means anus. So you want to avoid mistakes like that because it's also a part of respect and making sure that we're respectful of our clients and their language. And little things like that can cause a lot of trouble. Next slide. So any documents that you have, we really want to make sure that you're printing them in all the languages that are needed, if possible. And you'll know your area, you'll know where you're working, hopefully, and you'll know what languages need to be there, but also have access to any languages that you might not have readily available. Anytime you're doing any kind of information or tabling, make sure that you have everything on a shared table. We don't want to separate it and segregate by language group because we want to make sure that you're as inclusive as possible. And anytime you're talking about a document, let's say you're talking about requirements or what somebody should bring to an intake meeting, you want to make sure that you can point to it. Or if you're doing a presentation so that you're projecting it. Again, so that people have some type of visual to follow along, right? If you're talking about percentiles or you're talking about rates or ranges, anything like that, numbers, it's a great way to help people who are already struggling to understand you perhaps in English. And keep in mind, working with with an interpreter can be very tricky as well, because you're having to train yourself to listen to the message originally and then the interpretation. And for a lot of folks, right, they're trying to capture as much of the English as possible, perhaps, because there might be a mistrust with the interpreter. So with that, as we're coming to the end, next slide, just wanted to share with you a little bit about the services that Just Communities offers, in case any of you are interested in following up. One or Many Voices is an expansion of this webinar that you're seeing here, really talking about how to work with interpreters, the why of language justice. Again, really going deep into why we don't just work in English and expect people to work in English with us. For those of you who are bilingual or have bilingual staff, we also have 2 different trainings for interpreters. So the folks that you're going to be using perhaps that are staff and will be interpreting for you in these situations, they can come and learn the ethics and the standards, the practice, the protocols. We also do a lot of customized language justice consulting and coaching such as this. So in case you're interested to find out more about language access guidelines, federal requirements, and things like that. Next slide. My information is there. I know you all, if you perhaps had questions, you've been typing them in, but any follow-up that you'd like, please feel free to reach out, take a look at our website. But really, we do a lot of work around systems change, around strategic thinking and planning to make sure that the service that you're delivering and the atmosphere that you're delivering it in is as inclusive as possible. And so we offer professional development and consulting as well. Next slide. And so as next steps, really just want you to think about maybe one tool that was mentioned during this presentation that you could use to improve language access in your practice. It can be very overwhelming, especially if it's the first time that you're hearing about how to work with interpreters or immigrant populations. And so it's very important not to get overwhelmed and really start by picking maybe just one thing that you can change in your own practice. Maybe if it's, understanding the difference between interpretation and translation, or maybe it's going back and saying, okay, I'm not going to make generalizations, or like, wow, I use a lot of acronyms when I talk, so I have to make sure that I'm not doing that or that I'm expanding on them. And really thinking, how might it make a difference for your own practice, for the clients that are seeking your services, for the atmosphere that you're working in. Next slide. So I'm going to wrap up here. I want to thank you all so much for being part of this webinar today, and for the organizers for hosting and having me on today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lena. That was really, really amazing. I appreciate so much the perspective that you brought to this discussion. I really hope that our listeners also found some useful information that can help shape their interactions with people who may not use English as their preferred language. I had so many takeaways from that. It was just really incredible. With this expansion of CalFresh, we've really tried to keep language access in focus throughout this entire year of planning and preparation. And I think as a department, certainly as a program, we have really been more mindful and thoughtful about our language access for this launch than ever before. It's something I think we're all proud of. We've all learned a ton through this. I think we learned even more today, and I appreciate that this was something geared not just to our county partners and CBOs, but to all of us. I mean, I think that there was something for everyone in here. So again, thank you, Lena, so much. I wanted to highlight a few more resources on the next slide here. We've got some links to our CDSS language services and rights, as well as some links to our county resource toolkits, which can help paint a picture of what some of our county partners are doing in this space. So those links are shown here on screen. You can also access those through our CalFresh SSI webpage that I've spoke about a few times. Next slide. And I'll just do one final reminder for the 1 o'clock webinar that we're hosting today, Serving Diverse Communities and Advancing Racial Equity. I encourage you to register for that one. And again, if you've missed any of the previous ones, all of those will be uploaded with Q&As as well to our website. calfreshssi@dss.ca.gov is the email address. If you've got any questions, you can also email our team, and we can direct traffic. If we don't have the answer directly, we will send it to who can answer that for you. So again, the website and email address is there. That's all for us right now. We'll join you again this afternoon. Thank you so much, Lena, and have a great day, everyone.